The winter dusk settled over London like a slow, suffocating veil, thick with smoke, fear, and the metallic scent of machinery pushed far beyond its intended limits. And within the dim corridors of the government code and cipher school at Bletchley, Alan Turing moved with the fragile urgency of a man who understood that time was a living enemy, one with claws that dug deeper every hour a message remained unsolved. He had ignored MI6 protocol again and again, avoiding forms, bypassing clearance sequences, refusing delays imposed by men who valued hierarchy over imminence. Tonight, he ignored them entirely, stepping past a locked office as though the world were not made of locks at all, but only of moments, and every moment misused meant another hull beneath the channel torn open by German steel. His fingers trembled not with fear, but with the electric tension of thought, racing faster than any machine he had built, and he believed, with a faith that bordered on obsession, that the encrypted burst on his desk, an Enigma transmission intercepted only hours before, carried within it the hinge on which hundreds of lives were swinging between survival and the cold black Atlantic. He worked alone, the others exhausted, dispersed, or obedient. The bomb machine drummed its relentless rhythm behind him like a distant, methodical thunder. Paper scraps littered the floor, strange fragments of logic and probability that formed constellations only he could read. He tasted metal in the back of his throat as the final alignment snapped into place inside his mind, that eerie moment when chaos folded into order. When the message decoded fully beneath his hands, he felt a surge of something almost violent. A convoy, unprotected, undersupplied, and heartbreakingly slow, was moving straight into the path of a wolf pack. Hours away, maybe less. MI6 protocol demanded that decoded material pass through at least 3 validating stations before being transmitted to Churchill, and those stations slept behind layers of bureaucracy, each believing that proper procedure was the shield of civilization. Turing saw instead what procedure cost: the ghosts of men not yet dead. He left the decoding room with the message clutched in his fist, the paper warm and softening from the sweat of his palm. He could already hear the reprimands, the disciplinary reviews, the quiet discussions behind heavy doors about whether the man who built miracles was worth the chaos he caused. But he walked faster, moving through the frigid air, ignoring the security officer calling after him. He crossed MI6's threshold with the sharp sensation that every ticking second pressed like a blade against the world. A driver waited outside, stunned by Turing's sudden appearance, and before he could protest, Turing had ordered him to the war rooms with a tone so fierce and uncharacteristically decisive that the soldier simply obeyed. The car rattled through the blackout streets, headlights hooded, tires slipping on frozen patches. City lights ghosted faintly behind curtains of smoke drifting from bombed-out quarters. Turing pressed the telegram to his chest and tried not to think of the men aboard the convoy's ships, some likely writing to wives who would never open the letters, some laughing over cards, all trusting in a nation whose machinery of secrecy threatened to betray them more effectively than any German cipher. When he reached the war rooms, the guards bristled instantly, prepared to send him back into the night, with the cold disdain bureaucracy holds for urgency. Yet something in his expression, a near-feral clarity, the look of a man who had solved death's puzzle and now needed an audience before the pieces vanished, made them pause. They escorted him to Churchill's antechamber, a room thick with maps, ashtrays, and the muffled throb of wartime decisions. The Prime Minister emerged minutes later, wrapped in that mixture of weariness and immutable defiance the world had come to recognize as his uniform. Churchill looked at Turing with a curiosity tinged with irritation. He had heard the name, of course, whispered in MI6 corridors, spoken among mathematicians with a reverence bordering on myth. But Churchill also knew men who thought themselves indispensable were often the ones who broke order at the worst possible moment. He demanded an explanation. And so Turing, breath still ragged from the cold, spoke with a blunt clarity he rarely dared to use, describing the broken protocol, the intercepted message, the convoy's peril, and the hours slipping through their fingers like water through cracked glass. He confessed that he had deliberately circumvented every rule designed to prevent precisely this kind of unauthorized escalation. But when he handed Churchill the decrypted paper, something in the Prime Minister's posture changed. Not softened exactly, but shifted, as though a weight had been realigned inside him. He read the message slowly, then again, and his jaw tightened with the silent ferocity of a man confronted not with insubordination, but with necessity. He looked up, cigar ember glowing like a small red star in the half-light. And in that moment, between two men whose minds moved in utterly different geometries, a strange acknowledgement passed, unspoken but unmistakable. Churchill exhaled and said something that Turing would remember for the rest of his life, a sentence carved from a blend of annoyance, admiration, and pragmatic acceptance, one that belonged not to a statesman nor to a commander, but to a man who understood that survival often demands faith in those who refuse to follow the path laid before them. Churchill stood in silence for a long moment, the decoded message trembling faintly in his hand, the air around him thick with the ghostly rhythm of ticking clocks and the faint echo of distant gunfire that seemed to seep even into the heart of London. The map wall behind him was an ocean of pins, threads, and grim statistics. His eyes, weary yet sharp, travelled across Turing's face as though assessing whether this pale, awkward man had just committed brilliance or treason. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that peculiar gravity of command, laced with an almost paternal fatigue. "You broke protocol, Turing," he said quietly, words like flint against the air. But perhaps it was the protocol that was broken to begin with. He drew on his cigar, smoke curling around him like a fog of contemplation. "The enemy will not wait for our signatures and forms. If this message is true, then your disobedience has bought us time, something our Admiralty has been bleeding for months." Turing remained silent, unsure whether this was praise or the prelude to punishment. He had never sought approval, only accuracy, and now that the machine of war had turned its gaze upon him, he felt the uncomfortable heat of being seen. Churchill motioned to an aide. "Wake the Admiralty. Tell them to redirect convoy HX-229 southeast immediately, and tell them the information comes from a source they'll never hear of again." The aide hesitated for half a second. Churchill's eyes hardened, and the man vanished to obey. When the door shut, the Prime Minister turned back to Turing. "You understand, of course, that this will cause uproar in MI6. You've embarrassed half the chain of command before breakfast. But if your numbers are right, and I suspect they are, then we may have just snatched hundreds of men from the sea's mouth. That, my dear Professor, is a sin I can live with." Turing's mind flickered between relief and dread. He had expected confrontation, perhaps dismissal, but not this strange, almost paternal validation. "Sir," he said softly, his voice cracked by sleeplessness, "the system cannot afford to delay for its own comfort. Enigma adapts. Every delay breeds a new version of it." Churchill nodded slowly, eyes narrowing in thought. Yes, I imagine that's true. The Germans have their machines, and we have ours. But the real machines are men like you, aren't they? Ones who refuse to wait." He smiled faintly, though his tone remained edged with realism. "Still, if you make a habit of this kind of defiance, you'll drive the entire establishment mad." He leaned closer, voice lowering to a private murmur. "Just make sure next time your insubordination saves us something equally tangible. The Empire tolerates rebellion only when it delivers results." Outside, the war rooms hummed into motion, telephones clattering, typewriters hammering as orders flew through the underground veins of the British war machine. The message that had once been a string of incomprehensible letters now unfolded across the Atlantic like an invisible shield, rerouting steel and flesh away from the waiting jaws of German submarines. Turing, standing there amid the chaos, felt the conflicting pull of vindication and exhaustion. He had crossed a line, and though Churchill had pardoned him in spirit, the shadow of bureaucratic vengeance was already forming behind him. MI6 would demand explanations, the director would demand apologies, and the papers he loathed would demand nothing less than silence. Yet none of that mattered tonight. Somewhere in the Black Atlantic, ships would change course, lives would be spared, and the war, however briefly, would tilt a fraction towards mercy. Churchill moved back to his desk, pouring a small measure of whiskey into 2 glasses. He gestured toward Turing without looking. "You don't strike me as a drinking man, but humour an old fool," he said, handing him the second glass. The amber liquid caught the lamplight, warm against the cold of the underground chamber. "History, Mr. Turing, rarely forgives the obedient." The line landed like a verdict, half blessing, half warning. They drank in silence, the kind of silence that acknowledges the weight of all that cannot be spoken. Then Churchill added, almost as an afterthought, "If this episode ever reaches the ears of my intelligence officers, I shall deny it entirely. But between us, thank you for ignoring the rules. You may have just saved England's heart from drowning." By dawn, Turing was gone, escorted quietly back to Bletchley under guard, not as a prisoner, but as a necessary secret. In the halls of MI6, whispers already festered, stories of insubordination, of mathematicians overstepping their bounds, of Churchill meddling in operational conduct. But in that small hidden corner of the war, where code met conscience, an unspoken alliance had been forged. The statesman who ruled by instinct and the logician who ruled by precision had, for one impossible night, understood each other completely. The decoded message had vanished into classified archives, marked for prime ministers' eyes only, but the ripple it caused would echo through months of war, saving convoys, reshaping protocol, and reminding those who served that sometimes victory demanded not obedience but courage wrapped in defiance. Outside, the first grey light broke over London's rooftops, revealing a city that still breathed despite every wound. Somewhere beneath that pale light, a man named Alan Turing walked back into anonymity, his mind already turning toward the next problem, the next impossible code, the next moral trespass that would keep the world from collapsing. If you've reached this point, tell me, where in the world are you reading from? The day after the decoding, the air at Bletchley Park was brittle with tension. The thin frost over the lawns looked like ash, and the men and women walking between huts carried their files like shields, sensing that something extraordinary, something unsanctioned, had happened in the night. Alan Turing entered quietly, coat buttoned up to his chin, the faint scent of Churchill's cigar smoke still haunting his memory. He had expected reprimand, perhaps even dismissal, yet what awaited him was more insidious than punishment. Silence. MI6 had chosen not to make noise about his transgression. They would not imprison a man who had just averted catastrophe, but neither would they forgive him. He was to be tolerated, observed, and eventually forgotten. The bureaucracy's favourite form of revenge. Hut 8 buzzed faintly, the mechanical pulse of the bomb machine punctuating the room like a heartbeat. Joan Clark, her eyes hollow from sleeplessness, glanced up when Turing entered. "They said you went to London," she murmured, her voice both curious and fearful. "They said you spoke to him." Turing hesitated, as though speaking Churchill's name aloud might collapse the fragile sanctity of what had transpired. "I did," he said simply. He listened. She studied him, unsure whether to feel awe or dread. "And?" He smiled faintly, a ghost of something that might once have been pride. "He told me to keep breaking rules, so long as they break the right things." The others watched him, uncertain whether to admire or distrust the man who had just risked everything for an idea. To them, the war was numbers and wires, a cold abstraction of men dying somewhere far beyond the horizon of their own endurance. But to Turing, every decoded signal was a human cry rendered into symbols, every solved pattern a rescue, every failure a grave. That afternoon, as snow began to fall softly against the window panes, he returned to his equations, hands trembling slightly from fatigue and adrenaline. He was no longer merely solving for logic, he was solving for time, for the sliver of existence that divided survival from oblivion. Meanwhile, in London, Churchill's decision was already being contested in whispers. MI6 officials complained of protocol violated, of hierarchy undermined. One memorandum called Turing a liability concealed within genius. Another warned that the Prime Minister's indulgence of eccentric minds may endanger operational discipline. Churchill, reading these reports with a weary smirk, simply wrote in the margin, "Action this day. Protect the man who wins wars with thought." The phrase would later become legend among those who understood its true meaning, though Turing himself would never see it. Bureaucracy, Churchill knew, could not comprehend brilliance. It could only seek to contain it, to neuter what it could not understand. And so, while the rest of his cabinet debated rules and titles, Churchill quietly ensured Turing's work would continue, unseen, unthanked, but essential. Back in Bletchley, Turing wrestled with his own solitude. The triumph of saving the convoy had not filled him with joy, but with a quiet ache. Victory was only temporary. Another code always waiting. Another night spent listening to the machine grind against the limits of human patience. The others around him began to sense the weight he carried, the burden of knowing too much, of touching patterns that foretold life and death. Joan tried to speak to him once, gently, about rest, about food, about the necessity of being human amidst the machinery. He listened politely, then turned back to his equations as though her words were another cipher yet to be broken. "The mind doesn't rest," he said finally. "It just changes the subject." Outside, war continued its grim tempo. The convoys, redirected by Turing's disobedience, reached port safely, though few ever learned why. Newspapers spoke of luck, of divine weather, of strategic foresight. None mentioned the pale mathematician who had gambled against his own government to make it possible. And perhaps that was fitting, Turing thought. Perhaps the truest acts of heroism are those that cannot survive the light. He began to code again, refining the bomb, making it faster, hungrier. Every adjustment felt like a form of atonement, a way to quiet the echo of Churchill's voice in his head, the voice that had told him history would never forgive the obedient. He wondered whether disobedience, too, would forgive him. In those rare moments when he allowed himself to rest, Turing would recall the look in Churchill's eyes when he read the decoded message. Not triumph, but a deep and weary gratitude edged with sadness. The Prime Minister had seen what few ever could, the unbearable cost of every decision, the way salvation for some was always bought with the sacrifice of others. Turing had glimpsed in him not just a leader, but a mirror of his own torment. Two men condemned to make impossible choices for the sake of a world too fragile to survive without them. Weeks later, Churchill sent him a handwritten note, unsigned, delivered through an intermediary. It read simply, "When machines think faster than men, men must learn to act faster than machines. C." Turing folded the note and placed it in a drawer, unread by anyone else. It remained there for years, a relic of a moment when mathematics and politics had met in the narrow corridor between defiance and duty. Outside his window, the wind pressed against the panes, carrying with it the distant echo of sirens from London. Reminders that even the greatest codebreakers could not decipher the full cruelty of war. Yet somewhere beneath that chaos, he felt a quiet certainty that his rebellion had been not against authority, but against indifference itself. The snow thickened that night, muting the sound of the machines, softening even the metallic heart of Bletchley. And for the first time in months, Turing allowed himself to close his eyes beside the flickering light of the bomb, its rhythmic pulse lulling him towards sleep. The war would wait for him only briefly, but in that brief pause, the world felt, if only for a heartbeat, saved. If you've reached this far, I'd love to know, have you subscribed yet? The thaw came suddenly, as if winter had been holding its breath for too long and finally exhaled across the fields of Buckinghamshire. The mud paths around Bletchley turned slick and brown, the trees glistened with melting frost, and the huts, those anonymous boxes of history, seemed to sag beneath the weight of too many secrets. Alan Turing walked between them, his coat unbuttoned, his mind burning with new designs. His defiance had saved lives, but it had also marked him. MI6 officers now attended his briefings, not to assist but to observe, their eyes cold with the suspicion reserved for men who think too freely. Each report he filed, each cipher he cracked, was now filtered through layers of scrutiny. And yet, in that suffocating watchfulness, he found a peculiar freedom. The knowledge that nothing he did could shock them more than what he had already done. Inside Hut 8, the air was alive with the clatter of machines and the staccato rhythm of pencils scratching across paper. The bomb machine towered like a mechanical cathedral, its turning drums spinning with relentless precision. Turing stood before it, fingers twitching as if conducting an invisible orchestra. His team, young, pale, exhausted, followed his instructions without question, drawn into the orbit of his intensity. He had begun constructing an improvement, a device that could predict Enigma's changing settings with greater speed, a machine that would not merely respond to German code, but anticipate it. He called it the Prophet, though never aloud. To him, the name carried a blasphemy too dangerous to speak. One night, Joan Clark approached him as he hunched over his calculations, lamplight carving deep shadows under his eyes. "They say Churchill protected you," she whispered, "that he personally forbade MI6 from touching you. Is it true?" Turing didn't look up. "Churchill doesn't protect people. He protects outcomes." She frowned, sensing the weariness beneath his words. "You sound as though you despise him." He shook his head slowly. "No, I envy him. He can act without proof. I need proof before I breathe." The silence between them stretched, filled only by the clicking of relays and the low hum of the machine that never slept. Then, almost gently, Joan said, "You broke the rules, Alan, and the world didn't end." He smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the tumblers spinning before him. "The world never ends. It just waits for the next equation." But outside those walls, the war was changing. Germany's communication patterns grew erratic, unpredictable. New ciphers, faster rotations, layers upon layers of encryption that mocked even Bletchley's brilliance. It was as if the enemy had learned to think like Turing, cold, precise, and pitiless. He began sleeping at the park, his cot wedged between rows of paper and metal. His dreams were filled with whirring drums and phantom numbers cascading across the dark. Sometimes he dreamed of Churchill too, standing in smoke and silence, saying again that history would not forgive the obedient. But in those dreams, the Prime Minister's face always blurred at the edges, replaced by the faces of drowned sailors, their eyes pale and glassy beneath black water. Each success now carried the taste of guilt. Then, one morning, a sealed envelope arrived. The mark of the Prime Minister's office glinted in red wax. Inside, a single page, typed and signed by Churchill himself. "To the man who broke time to save it, continue at all costs." No instruction, no preamble, just the command of faith. Turing folded it carefully and placed it in his jacket, where it would stay until the end of the war. He told no one, yet the note also brought new danger. MI6 learned of it, and within days, the quiet surveillance became open hostility. Meetings turned colder. Questions became interrogations. Did you contact the Prime Minister directly again? Do you share decrypted intelligence without authorization? Do you believe you are above command? Turing answered each with the same calm precision he applied to his mathematics. But beneath that composure he felt the slow constriction of a noose woven from rules. His work became both sanctuary and prison, the bomb his only confessor. One evening, as the sun sank behind the blackout curtains, Joan found him staring into the machine's rotating drums. "You can't keep this pace," she said softly. "You'll destroy yourself." He didn't move. "The war will end one day," he murmured. "And when it does, they'll all forget what was done to keep it from ending sooner. The only way to survive this war is to disappear inside it." She placed a hand on his shoulder, but he did not turn. "They'll remember," she whispered. "Someone will." But he knew she was wrong. In his heart, He already sensed that the war's end would be less a celebration than a quiet burial of truths too complex for peace to hold. And in London, Churchill was already fighting a different battle, the political one. His faith in men like Turing had cost him allies among the intelligence hierarchy. Some called it recklessness, others obsession. But Churchill, sitting alone with his reports late at night, understood the deeper truth. Wars are not won by obedience. They are won by those willing to see beyond the edges of instruction, to grasp the terrifying responsibility of acting before permission arrives. He would later describe that night, Turing's intrusion, the broken protocol, the decision to trust him, as one of the only moments in the war when he felt he'd glimpsed the divine flicker of genius in its rawest form. A man of logic, he wrote privately, who behaved at last like a man of faith. And so, as the thaw deepened and spring crept hesitantly across England, the strange alliance between the mathematician and the statesman remained unspoken but unbroken. Two minds on opposite ends of the human spectrum, one bound to reason, the other to instinct, had collided in defiance of everything their world demanded of them. And though neither would ever meet again, both would carry the imprint of that night when rules were shattered to preserve what rules were meant to protect. The snow was gone, the earth wet and raw, and the machines kept turning. By the summer of 1943, the war had matured into a kind of monstrous equilibrium, neither side winning, neither surrendering, both exhausting the human spirit to feed the machinery of endurance. Bletchley Park had become its own world by then, a cloister of minds chained to metal, rhythm, and secrecy. Alan Turing lived within it like a monk of logic, rarely speaking, always listening, to the whir of gears, to the hiss of teleprinters, to the small voice inside that told him he was not merely solving ciphers, but holding back the tide of annihilation by sheer willpower. His defiance months earlier had become a rumour buried under new layers of urgency, yet the echo of it remained. There were still officers who looked at him with quiet resentment, and clerks who whispered of Churchill's favour as though it were sorcery. None of them knew the truth, that the Prime Minister had not sent another word since that note commanding him to continue at all costs. Perhaps he did not need to. The words themselves had been enough to transform Turing's sense of purpose into something dangerously close to obsession. Each day began before dawn. He would walk to the hut before the others, his breath fogging in the cool air, his mind already whirring through permutations. By the time his team arrived, he had filled pages with indecipherable symbols, arcs of logic that bent like constellations across the paper. Joan Clark sometimes found him speaking softly to the machine, as though coaxing it to reveal what human patience could not. "It knows," he said once, not looking up. "It knows when I'm close." She watched him with a quiet mixture of admiration and fear. The man who had once been awkward and hesitant now moved with the intensity of someone who had glimpsed the shape of the infinite and refused to look away. But beneath that brilliance lay a growing disquiet. The MI6 officers assigned to monitor him were no longer content to observe. They questioned his methods, audited his communications, demanded summaries of his results. Turing complied when he must, but he could feel their presence like shadows on the periphery of his mind. They didn't trust what they couldn't understand, and what they couldn't understand was the essence of his genius. In their eyes, his mind was both weapon and threat. To them, his brilliance was a code that might one day turn on its own masters. Then, in June, an unmarked car appeared at Bletchley. From it emerged a man Turing recognized instantly, not by face, but by bearing. Sir Stuart Menzies, head of MI6, tall, immaculate, and cold as porcelain. He entered Hut 8 without introduction, his mere presence silencing the room. Turing rose, hands smudged with graphite, heart quickening. Menzies inspected the machine, the charts, the faces of those who worked there, and then spoke in a tone that was both polite and lethal. "You've built something extraordinary here, Dr. Turing. Something beyond our comprehension. And perhaps that is precisely the problem." He gestured toward the bomb. You must understand this war is not only about what we can achieve, but about who controls achievement. You disobeyed once, and the Prime Minister indulged you. Do not imagine he will do so again. Turing listened, expression unreadable. If I had not disobeyed, sir, he said quietly, those men would be dead. Menzies' eyes narrowed. And if every man in this war behaved as you did, there would be no war to win, only chaos. The words hung between them, sharp and heavy. Then, with a faint smile, Menzies added, the Prime Minister may tolerate miracles. I prefer procedure. When he left, the hut remained silent. Turing sat back down, the hum of the machine filling the void where words had failed. Joan placed a hand on his arm, but he did not move. He knew what the warning meant. His freedom, once tolerated, was now conditional. He had become indispensable but untrustworthy, a paradox too dangerous to resolve. Yet even as fear coiled around him, another part of him, the part that had defied MI6 and looked Churchill in the eye, began to whisper again. The same impulse that had driven him to break rules now urged him to surpass his own inventions. If he could predict Enigma once, why not predict everything? If machines could decode the minds of men, perhaps they could also decode the future itself. That night, while others slept, Turing returned to his desk. He dismantled part of the bomb, his fingers moving with surgical precision, sweat beading on his forehead. He scribbled new algorithms, new variables, notes about memory, iteration, and what he called learning behavior. It was madness to the world around him, but to him it was clarity. He was no longer fighting Germany. He was fighting time, entropy, ignorance. He believed, for one feverish moment, that Churchill had seen this too. That the Prime Minister's command to continue at all costs was not about Enigma at all, but about the very evolution of thought. Meanwhile, in London, Churchill received the latest reports from Bletchley with his usual evening whiskey. He read Menzies' complaint in silence, the lines about Turing's increasing instability and dangerous theoretical digressions. Then he smiled faintly, a kind of private rebellion flickering in his eyes. "We cannot fight a war without madmen," he muttered, and scrawled his familiar instruction in the margin. "Leave him be." But he knew the tide of the bureaucracy would not hold forever. Empires, like machines, had limits of tolerance. As summer deepened, Turing's experiments grew wilder, his exhaustion more visible. Sometimes, when the machine jammed or a solution eluded him, he would stand before it and whisper, "You're right. I am the error." The others began to worry. Yet in that quiet unravelling, there was also brilliance. The bomb, his miracle of metal and logic, began solving patterns that had baffled entire divisions. Convoys arrived safely. Air raids were intercepted, and still he pressed on, as if saving the world had become a habit he could not unlearn. He thought often of Churchill, of the night the Prime Minister had looked at him not as a subordinate, but as an equal. He wondered if Churchill ever regretted that moment, or if, like him, he carried it as a secret badge of faith. Perhaps both knew that rules were only scaffolds, and that progress began the moment one dared to climb beyond them. And so, while Europe burned and London smouldered, Alan Turing sat amid the endless turning of his machines, the faint hum of victory blending with the slow decay of his own humanity. Autumn arrived with a strange stillness, a deceptive calm that hung over Britain like the breath held between storms. The great cities bore their scars with quiet pride, buildings standing half-broken but unbowed, the air carrying the faint tang of coal, rain, and the weary heartbeat of a nation learning to live inside its own endurance. At Bletchley Park, the days folded into one another like pages written in the same hand. Alan Turing barely left Hut 8 now. His world had shrunk to numbers and metal, and somewhere inside that confinement he had begun to disappear, though not in the way his superiors had hoped. He was vanishing into brilliance, into the boundless machinery of his own invention. The bomb was no longer enough. He was building something new, a design he whispered to no one, not even to Joan. It existed half in diagrams, half in dreams. A machine that could not only decode but think. A mind made of copper and logic, stripped of fear, capable of discerning patterns too vast for any human to see. He knew what they would say if he revealed it. Madness, delusion, arrogance. Yet he also knew that every great leap began as heresy. And so, while the officers who distrusted him grew louder in their suspicions, Turing moved in silence, trusting that time itself might one day vindicate his disobedience. The nights were colder now. He worked by lamplight, his hands stained with grease and ink, his breath clouding in the frigid air. Sometimes he would pause, listening to the faint creak of the building, and imagine he could still hear the echoes of Churchill's voice from that night long ago, the voice that had both condemned and absolved him in the same breath. History rarely forgives the obedient. The words had become a prayer, or perhaps a curse. They justified every sleepless night, every trespass of protocol, every lie told to the men who guarded his door. Joan noticed the change. She would watch him from across the room, his thin figure haloed by the dull orange glow of the lamp, and she felt the growing distance between them, like watching a friend drift slowly into another dimension. "Alan," she said one evening, breaking the silence, "you've done enough. The war's turning. The Americans have joined. Maybe it's time to rest." He didn't look up. "The war doesn't end when guns stop, Joan. It ends when ignorance does." She hesitated, her voice trembling. "But ignorance is endless." Turing smiled faintly. "Then so am I." He turned back to his calculations. The lines blurred and reformed, equations folding into structures so intricate they seemed almost alive. He began keeping his notes locked away, each page marked with strange titles: child, mind, imitation. Joan caught glimpses of them and felt something beyond her comprehension taking shape. It frightened her, not because of what it might do, but because she sensed it would outlive them all. Meanwhile, in London, Churchill's power was beginning to wane. The tide of politics was shifting, new voices rising, voices tired of war, tired of eccentric geniuses and expensive miracles. Yet even as ministers debated the Prime Minister's future, Churchill continued to protect Bletchley's secrecy with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. He had come to see Turing's work not merely as an instrument of victory, but as a symbol of what England had become under siege, a nation forced to trust its misfits. He would speak of it privately to his secretaries, recalling the night the young mathematician had burst through protocol to deliver salvation. "He broke the rules," Churchill would murmur, because he understood that rules are the slowest form of courage. As the months wore on, victory began to glimmer faintly on the horizon. German communications grew desperate, fractured. The Enigma, once a fortress, now leaked secrets faster than it could be repaired. Turing's improvements, subtle adjustments to timing, to mechanical logic, had rendered it mortal. And yet, with each success, he grew paler, thinner, as though each broken code took a fragment of him with it. The war was being won, but he was dissolving into the machinery that made it possible. Then, one night, he received an unexpected envelope bearing the seal of the Prime Minister's office. Inside, a single line typed on crisp white paper. "You have done enough, Alan. The rest belongs to time." There was no signature. He read it again and again, unsure whether it was mercy or dismissal. For the first time in years, he left his desk and stepped outside. The sky was vast and moonless. The air smelled of wet leaves and coal. He stood there for a long while, listening to the distant hum of machines inside the huts, and felt an unfamiliar stillness settle over him. He realized then that the war, for him, would never truly end. It would echo inside every algorithm, every pattern, every machine he ever conceived. And perhaps that was the price. Some men fought in trenches, others in shadows. He had fought inside thought itself. Behind him, the lights of Bletchley flickered faintly, like stars caught in fog. Ahead, the future waited, cold, brilliant, and merciless. The war ended not with a roar, but with a a slow unwinding of tension that left the air hollow and strange. Across Britain, church bells rang for the first time in years, though to men like Alan Turing, the sound felt almost foreign, as if joy itself had forgotten how to speak their language. London lit its streets again, people laughed in the open, and soldiers kissed strangers beneath banners of victory. Yet in Bletchley Park, there was no celebration, only the mechanical aftertaste of work, abruptly silenced. The machines were dismantled, the papers burned, and the men and women who had lived in secrecy for years were told to return to lives that no longer existed. Turing stood amid the quiet ruins of Hut 8, surrounded by dust and the faint ghost of the hum that had once filled the air. His hands, so accustomed to motion, now hung idle at his sides. For the first time in years, there was no code to break, no convoy to save, no rule to defy. He had obeyed the final instruction, he had done enough, and yet he felt hollowed out, like a machine switched off, but still dreaming of movement. The silence pressed against him with a strange cruelty. The world had moved on, but he was still tuned to the frequency of crisis. His mind restless in peacetime, he returned to Cambridge for a time, resuming his research with the same detached precision that had once saved nations. But in every equation he wrote, he heard echoes of Bletchley, the whirring of gears, the click of relays, the murmured voices of colleagues now scattered across the country, forbidden to speak of what they had done. The secrecy that had protected them during war now served as their cage. When people spoke of victory, they mentioned Churchill's speeches, Montgomery's strategy, the courage of soldiers. They never spoke of men like Turing, of the silent wars fought in the folds of mathematics and night. And perhaps that was fitting. Heroes of silence are rarely meant to be remembered. Yet one night, years later, Turing received a small envelope postmarked from Westminster. Inside, on plain stationery, was a short handwritten note, unmistakably in Churchill's hand. I've often wondered what became of the man who broke time. I trust he's still ignoring the right rules. There was no signature, only the faint trace of cigar smoke embedded in the paper. Turing smiled when he read it, though something inside him ached. He imagined the Prime Minister older now, heavier with the weight of history. His words still shaped like commands, even when meant as affection. He folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the first one, the command from years before that had changed everything. The two notes sat together like bookends on the shelf of his life. Continue at all costs. You have done enough. Between them lay the sum of his existence. As years passed, the nation forgot him, as nations often do with the ones who save them too quietly. But the machines he imagined did not forget. They multiplied, evolved, and began to think in ways he had only glimpsed. His ideas seeped into the bones of the future, invisible yet inescapable. Somewhere, in the endless circuitry of time, his defiance still pulsed. A reminder that reason alone can win wars, but courage defies them. Churchill, before his death, once spoke privately of that night in 1942, when a frail mathematician had broken every rule to deliver salvation. He acted without permission, the old man said, staring into his glass. And because he did, we survived. He paused, a glimmer of rueful pride softening his features. If history remembers me kindly, it will be because I once trusted a man who refused to wait. And so the story of Alan Turing faded into silence, buried under state secrets and classified files. Yet his rebellion, small, precise, and infinite, lived on in the hum of every machine that came after him. For every code that was ever broken, every pattern ever solved, there echoed, faint but unyielding, the same defiant whisper that had changed the course of the war. Ignore the rules, save the time. The screen fades to black. A final line appears, white against darkness, dedicated to those who disobeyed to keep the world alive. If this story moved you, remember to like and subscribe, so that history's quiet voices can keep being heard.